I wanted to finish off with a few quick points about buying a home in Australia. And in saying this, please note that I am making general comments of basically what I am doing myself. Everybody should seek their own advice, but just make sure that the person that is giving you that advice is fair dinkum and unbiased. Firstly, I should say that by a bank's definition, we can easily afford to buy a home right now. If we used our current savings as a deposit, banks would lend us enough for us to be able to purchase a $650,000 house. Even though our aim is to buy a home, we choose not to buy at present time for the reasons which I have alluded to earlier and which I will expand upon now. But before I do that, I think it's important to note that the virtues of buying versus renting have been debated for ages. Paul Clitheroe has an excellent discussion on the topic in the 1998 edition of his very well-known book, Making Money. He says that there are some good technical reasons why renting is preferable to buying, but he believes that buying is the better option because it is a form of forced savings. He presents a full analysis of the issue, and I want to point out some important points. Firstly, he states that IPAC research has shown that over the very long term, residential property has generally appreciated from 1% to 3% per annum above inflation. And he uses economic analysis by John Allison to compare the financial situation of someone who rents to someone who buys the same house. He uses inputs which he says reflected typical and real market conditions at the start of 1998 and took a conservative medium to long-term outlook based on the best available advice at the time. Now, it's important to note that in the analysis, in the model, he used $200,000 as the purchase price, a 20% deposit. Rent was about $175 per week, and the property value was predicted to increase by 4.5% per annum over the 25 years of the loan life. Now, nobody could blame Paul for not predicting the house price bubble because nobody else did. But these are reasonable assumptions when the market is behaving normally. The result of this analysis shows that on a cumulative basis, the renter would be ahead until the 6th year. Paul also highlights that the results change considerably if you alter just one parameter. If the mortgage were less, or if you bought the property for less, or if the property appreciated in value quicker, the buyer's relative position would improve. But obviously the opposite is true, and the renter's position would improve if you purchase the property for more, or if the value of the property appreciated at a slower rate. So too if the rent as a percentage of house price value were less. Now, for example, Paul ran the model again with property growth only being 3.5% rather than 4.5%, and the renter in that case was ahead until the 11th year. And Paul uses this example to show just how important growth rate is to residential property returns. Now, as far as I've been able to determine, these discussions have been omitted from recent editions of the book. Perhaps Paul was concerned that his growth forecast would look foolishly conservative in the midst of the biggest housing bubble in history. But I would suggest that it is now very safe to reinstate the section. Perhaps he might even like to forecast house price growth of negative 14% per annum for a few years. It's a shame that he has not updated these analyses because, with realistic forecasts on house price movements from 2008 levels, renting would prove to be far and away more economically sound a decision. And moving on, even well-intentioned people talk about entering the property ladder. The property ladder is a construct of the vested interests that benefit out of turnover in housing. And of course that very much involves the real estate industry. But just think of how much it costs to buy and sell a house. About 10% of the price. If you buy a townhouse when you're young, trade up to a house when you have kids, and trade down to a retirement house or apartment, you've wasted a lot of money. And this is something that Paul also highlights in his book. Barring unforeseen circumstances, I will only ever buy one home. It will be a home that I can modify and adjust as my family grows, but it will also be suitable for my wife and I as we age. To our real estate friends, let's look at a few of their favourite lines. It's never a bad time to buy, and house prices never go down. While there most certainly are times when it is a bad decision to buy. If the forecast for house prices that I have developed, which is available on my website, comes to fruition, the last few years have been a very bad time to buy because, yes indeed, house prices can and have come down in the past. And given the size of this bubble, they are likely to come right down this time. That opinion is shared by many others. But I would caution people to think very carefully about what is a fair price. Just think, in 2001, do you think that someone would have thought that $350,000 was a fair price for an average home in an average Brisbane suburb? No way. The median price then was $140,000. A house is not cheap or even reasonably priced just because its resale value has dropped by 10%, and it doesn't make it a good financial decision to buy. I would argue that value can best be determined by looking at how much of a deposit you need to purchase a house compared with renting. And I have a spreadsheet of this on my website. For example, if I rent for $350 per week, but I want to buy a home for $400,000, I would need a deposit of $264,833 to maintain my standard of living. Of course, buying is also an emotional decision, but surely the emotional gain must outweigh the financial and emotional loss. In other words, it is reasonable to accept that you will forego some things when you buy as opposed to rent, but the emotional gain from living in your own home should outweigh the emotional loss from having extra financial commitments and everything that goes with it, such as loss of social life, eating out, and nowadays in Australia, children having to do without social activities such as excursions. In other words, in my view, Australian housing will remain overpriced until the standard of living gap more closely reflects the emotional gain of owning your own home. And the more we hear of families struggling with debt and regretting their decision to buy a home, either in the media or just by talking to friends, the more house prices will come to reflect that reality. We've had a huge bubble and people have gotten really carried away. For us, the timing was unfortunate. I doubt that house prices will get as cheap relative to wages as they were before this bubble for many, many years. Of course, house prices would need to halve for that to be the case. But I am certain that patience will be rewarded, and I think house prices are likely to get less and less expensive over the coming decade, with one caveat: as long as governments do not introduce even more distortions to boost house prices. That's why it's up to us to ensure that doesn't happen. Thank you very much for your time.